Dave Kieran. I teach in the history department here, but tonight I am here in my capacity as a member of the steering committee for our new African American Studies concentration. As many of you know, this fall marks the beginning of a concentration in African American Studies here at WMJ, and we're really thrilled to have it because it offers a curricular place for us that will help our students, our faculty, all of the members of our community put African American experiences at the center of U.S. culture and enhance our ongoing discussions on this campus about race, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And we're thrilled that we're able to mark the beginning of this concentration with tonight's lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, there's a few people that I need to thank. The first is Judy Kirkpatrick, our Vice President of Academic Affairs, and her staff, particularly Debbie Silver and Dory Baumgart, for contributing funds that made this speech possible, and also arranging for Dr. Cobb's travel and accommodations. I also want to thank the Mellon Fellows, of whom there are several in the room, for their support and for helping us with the funding. And in particular, my fellow members of the African American Studies Steering Committee, who are scattered about the room, who have also really played an enormous role and done a tremendous amount of work in putting together a concentration that's really going to enhance the curriculum in college. Katwana Shoes, who is not here at the moment, but members of the Black Student Union, particularly Carmen Carroll, who helped arrange the reception that we just had for Dr. Cobb prior to this, which was a really great experience for all of us. So we're pleased tonight to welcome to WMJ the award-winning journalist and scholar, Dr. Jelani Cobb. Dr. Cobb is probably best known to many of us as a columnist for the New Yorker, but he is also a professor of journalism at Columbia University, and he holds a doctorate in history from Rutgers. He is the recipient of the Sidney Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism for his work with the New Yorker, which examines the complexity of race and race relations in the United States. His columns include The Anger in Ferguson, Murders in Charleston, and What We Talk About When We Talk About Reparations. He has also received the Walter Bernstein Award from the Writers Guild of America for his investigative series Policing the Police, which appeared on PBS's Frontline. And he has really been very generous with his time this afternoon, meeting with several of our students and talking with them about everything from race in America to what you do after college. And so it's been really a treat to have you on campus. I'm very grateful that you've spent time with us. So please join me in welcoming Jelani Cobb to WMJ.
And I would also like to thank your campus for the invitation. And I also would like to congratulate you for your new African American Studies concentration. I believe that this is an important and crucial undertaking for reasons that will be apparent hopefully by the end of my talk. And also, I am very much, I have 5, I think, relatives in Pennsylvania, not on this part, in this part of the state. But I'm somehow a little bit closer, maybe. And I was able to get out of the city for a little while and I'll send a note like, oh yeah, I was around, didn't get a chance to see you. So thank you for the opportunity to come here. So, where do we begin? We live in vexing and complicated times. We, for me, as a person who has taught American history, African American history, and was the director of an African American Studies program at the University of Connecticut, we live in a time in which I often have, can I turn my mic down just a little bit? I'm getting an echo up here. Okay.
Sorry, brief intro to the
that my syllabus has leaped off the page. Because many of the things that we talk about, that we study as historians, have begun popping up as current events. And there was a kind of moment in 2016 in which I said to a friend of mine, jokingly but not really, that as all sorts of dynamics were being unleashed, and there were all sorts of political debates that were happening, and there was a kind of fervor and polarization that we hadn't seen overtly in many years in American politics, that I said to my colleague, well, at the very least, African American studies and women and gender studies have proven what it is we've been studying all these years. People are going like, oh, what exactly do they do in those departments and those programs? And as we saw, there being these awkward conversations around race, and these awkward conversations around gender that were happening really prior to 2016, but particularly acutely at that moment, we began saying, well, you see these things that everyone is upset about, that. We talk about those things, and we examine those things. We try to look at the roots of those things. And so, African American studies, depending upon where what your vantage point is, you say that the African American studies movement really kicks off in the 1960s on college campuses, where there is a great upsurge in student activism and demands that they begin to create a curriculum that reflects the exigencies and needs and the important issues and the crucial concerns of that particular point in time, of communities that have been long isolated and insulated from the mainstream of opportunities in the United States. And one of the first of these programs happened in 1968 at San Francisco State, where a psychologist by the name of Nathan Hare was hired to create a program that would be the first of the modern African American studies programs. But the roots of this discipline, the roots of this undertaking go much deeper. We could say that the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, and those volumes that he cranked out over the course of his lifetime around the crucial issues of slavery and the slave trade and the history of Reconstruction and the souls of black folk, and all these, his work around the ways in which African Americans have been denied full citizenship and the rationales for denying them that full citizenship was one of the origins of black studies. Well, that Carter G. Woodson, who was the second African American to get a PhD from Harvard University, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And he then went on to create the organization called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which was a kind of ad hoc African American studies program. He created it in 1915, and it had the objective of countering the racist stereotypes that were being promulgated in media and history and politics and from the American educational system, all of which dictated that African Americans were not fit for democracy and that they were should be subject to what we call second-class citizenship, or what was called second-class citizenship. Dr. Woodson was a particularly interesting figure in this regard. It's not coincidental, by the way, that the first two African Americans to gain doctorates from Harvard both did so in the field of history. That they were particularly concerned with setting the historical record straight about the African contributions and the black contributions to the onward tide of civilization. But Dr. Woodson had a unique vantage point on this, because not only was he the second doctorate, African American to gain a doctorate from Harvard, his parents were born in slavery. Woodson himself did not start high school until 21. worked at a coal mine. He went from high school to Berea College in Kentucky, and then went from Kentucky to Harvard University, where he set out to use his intellectual abilities to fight on behalf of civil rights for African Americans. And one of the kind of origin points, one of the crucial things to remember about the origins of this field, this discipline, is that it has always been an area that was concerned with the applicability of scholarship. That this was not simply an undertaking that could afford to be cloistered in the academic world. That African American Studies intended to create, as it were, a syllabus on behalf of the full humanity of people of color in this country. And one of the points that I always refer to my students to is that Dr. Woodson, in Washington, D.C. in 1919, there was a race riot that was part of a series of race riots that happened in the United States that were collectively known as the Red Summer of 1919. So there were race riots in East St. Louis, race riots in Chicago. There were dozens of them that happened across the country. And in the course of this, Dr. Woodson, who was living in Washington, D.C., turns a corner and sees a mob running toward him. He actually has to run away and manages to find shelter in a building where he stays until the violence is past and makes his way home. And so this was a literally life and death undertaking, a person who had to risk his life in order to create scholarship. And so I say that so we understand the importance of this discipline, of what African American Studies represents. And I'll come to the kind of modern incarnations of it, at the end of the talk. But let's go back a step. That, as someone who writes and speaks and lectures frequently about race, I've long had the vantage point that it's impossible to understand the United States, indeed impossible to understand the West, without understanding race. And it'd be easy to say, well, this is just because you're the guy that teaches about this, or who writes about this, and so it's a case of, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But go with me for a moment. Can't really understand this country without understanding race and the role that it's played in it. So if we go to the founding documents for the United States, we look at the Declaration of Independence, which we all read and became familiar with as school kids, children in school, elementary school, in high school, and social studies, and so on. And we know that Jefferson lists that litany of offenses that justify the colonies separating themselves from the British crown. But what we don't know is that in the original version of that document, Jefferson lists the transatlantic slave trade as one of the offenses that make it worthy, that make the colonies have a brief for separating from the British crown. So at the inception, the moment of the inception of this country, this question is on the table. And what he Jefferson says, is that this is an execrable trade, an execrable traffic in human beings. And he says that these are people who have done no harm to the British. But if they ever rise up and seek their freedom, it will be the colonies that suffer for it, not the British. And so he says this. The reason we don't know that is that that never makes it into the final version of the Declaration of Independence. And so it is effectively copy editing out the question of black freedom at the outset of the United States. If we move on to the US Constitution, that blueprint for the structure of American democracy, and we find that it is riddled and shot through with all these questions and concerns that relate specifically to race. And so at the same time that we are creating a democracy, at the same time that the founders are putting together the framework for an American democracy, there is a provision to protect the transatlantic slave trade. It says that you cannot outlaw the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And that has disastrous implications for people who are already unfortunate enough to be in the terrible condition of being trafficked as slaves in the first place. And I'll come back to that in a moment, what the implications of that are. There's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, meaning that if a person is fortunate enough to escape from slavery, they have to be returned to the condition of slavery. There is the 3/5 compromise, which holds that the enslaved population of the South shall be counted in 60% of their number. And so by 1860, on the verge of the Civil War, there are 4 million enslaved black people in the South, in the United States South. There are 2.5 million of them who were counted. But if you recall, there was this little dust-up, this minor conflict called the American Revolution. And there was this rhyming phrase. What was that phrase? No taxation. Work with me. Without representation. And so there has been a conflict. Y'all scared me for a second. There has been the country owes its origins in part to this question of representation and taxation. But slaves, people who are enslaved, cannot vote. Yet, that 2.5 million enslaved, the bodies of 2.5 million enslaved people are included in the calculations for how many representatives in the House Southern districts should have. So they are an effect of the 4 million people who were enslaved. They're counting 2.5 million people who have no ability to vote. Their bodies simply bolster the Southern political economy, Southern voting power. If we talk through the concrete implications of this in the Electoral College, it meant that the South was politically empowered. It derived political power directly from the individual, the bodies of the individuals from whom their liberty, for whom liberty had been stolen. This is wired, it's hardwired into the Constitution. So we have these documents. And we can say, okay, well, nobody's perfect, nothing's perfect, and you said that there's an element of race that we can see that's present in these documents and so on, but that's you're still going pretty far to say that we can't understand the country unless we understand race and the role that race plays in it. Well, let's think about something else. Let's turn to geography. A few years ago, I gave a talk in Maine. And while I was in Maine, I mentioned to my audience, very wonderful audience, people were very welcoming, and I mentioned to the audience that, and just in passing, like, oh, by the way, your state only exists because of slavery. And it was kind of quiet for a minute. And then it's like, remember that compromise of 1820 when Missouri wanted to enter the Union? And that would have tipped the balance because there were 11 states that were prohibited slavery and 11 states in which slavery was allowed. And were Missouri to enter as a slave state, it would have tipped the political balance in favor of slavery. There would have been 2 more senators from pro-slavery states and a number of more representatives in the House from a state that allowed slavery. And Henry Clay stepped in and negotiated that compromise that carved out a new state in New England called Maine. And it was there purely to offset the political power of the newly arriving state of Missouri. So we're here having this conversation in this state called Maine because of slavery. And it was like, oh yeah, awkward. And so I left Maine and I flew to Florida and I gave a talk in Florida. And when I got to Florida, it's like literally opposite end of the country. And when I get to Florida, I tell them what I told the people in Maine. And they were like, wow, really? And then I said, but before you get too smug, let's think about how Florida came into the Union. And that upstart general, Andrew Jackson, who in 1819 invaded what was then a Spanish possession, without the prior acknowledgement, prior order, or even prior informing President Monroe, marches into Florida, seizes it at the behest of slave owners in South Carolina and Georgia. And so one of the things that had happened is, like, this is what we know about slavery now, is that when people tried to escape, they tried to flee north, which is generally true, unless you were in the Deep South, in which it becomes a little bit more complicated. People who were in the Deep South would often try to flee into Mexico, especially prior to Texas separating from Mexico. Prior to 1819, people would try to flee into Florida, recognizing that the Spanish crown would likely not return you to slavery in the American colonies, and in the United States. And so, in 1819, recognizing the financial losses that were being incurred by slaveholders in South Carolina and Georgia, they petitioned Andrew Jackson, who marches in and seizes his territory, and then in a sort of rearguard diplomatic action to make this look better than it does, than it did at the time. There is a treaty negotiated for the purchase of Florida. This is how we wind up with Florida. You go, oh, okay, well, we're at the top and at the bottom. But if we went all the way out west to California, we see that California enters the Union in 1850. And the political compromise that allows California to enter the Union is directly connected to, again, this question of slavery, which is implicitly and explicitly connected to this question of race. So in 1850, the Compromise of 1850 allows California to become a state, a free state, in exchange for a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. But there is now a bureaucracy which will be charged with tracking down those black people who are fortunate enough to have escaped from slavery. And this is the trade-off that allows California to enter the Union. Or we were talking about Texas, and how the Americans in Texas, which was then the northeastern part of Mexico, came to have the conflict that culminated in the War of Independence. That recognizing the wealth that was being generated by cotton, the cotton economy in the United States, the Mexican government offers free land to American farmers. And in exchange, they will grow cotton, and the government will reap a windfall from the taxes on that cotton. And there are a few provisions, one of which is they have to convert to Catholicism, because they're predominantly Protestant. And the other is that they are not allowed to bring enslaved labor to Mexico. And both of these are provisions that they promptly ignore. And so when we say remember the Alamo, we don't remember everything about the Alamo and the ways in which these dynamics were tied together. So okay, we have the South, we have North, Florida, California. But then if we thought about the middle of the country, as a young person, as children in school, we invariably come to the point where we discuss the Louisiana Purchase and the great strategic and diplomatic maneuvering of Thomas Jefferson that doubled the size of the United States, that there are 13 states that in total or in some portion come or carved out of this new territory. The part that we tend not to talk about is that tiny French colony called Haiti, and a revolution that happens in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, and their drive to gain independence, and Haiti being the crown jewel of the French colonial possessions. Haiti alone, one colony, accounted for about 2/3 of the French colonial exports. And Haiti was a sugar-producing colony. And they're crucial to understand this, but for a couple of reasons. One is that sugar is a very labor-intensive crop. That if a person was enslaved, well, you, one, did not want to be enslaved, but you certainly did not want to grow tobacco. Worse off, you did not want to grow cotton, and you really, really did not want to grow sugar. But raise your hand if you've had sugar today. Okay, so the people who are admitting they've had sugar and the other people who are in denial about having sugar. But sugar is like impossible to avoid. It's very difficult to avoid. It's a staple in our diets. And the mass production of sugar, could you imagine if all the sugar you were selling was being grown in one place? How much money you would make for that? Like, I mean, if you were to kind of just close off sugar right now, they would have yanked everything out of the stores that had sugar in it. You couldn't get access to sugar. There would be bedlam. There'd be riots. There'd be people saying that, damn it, we're Americans. The Constitution means that we can have this. And France was reaping a great benefit from the sugar market until the revolution happens. And Toussaint Louverture, who defeats Napoleon's brother-in-law in navigating Haiti to its independence. And Napoleon is so disturbed by the economic implications of the loss of this colonial possession and the loss of the sugar revenue that comes with it. He is, when Thomas Jefferson comes to negotiate the purchase of this Louisiana territory, he is what they call, in real estate terms, a motivated seller. You know, when people were saying, I really have to get rid of this house, you know, like how much do you want for the house? I don't know, how much do you have on you? Like, that's like that kind of situation. And so, this is how we wind up with this Louisiana purchase. And so all these states, we're going from Canada all the way down, that are connected to this purchase are implicitly connected to this revolution, this slave revolt that happens in Haiti. And so some months back, when the president referred to Haiti as, you know, the term he did, I said, without Haiti, you wouldn't have the United States. Not in the sense that you have it now. It wouldn't look the way it looks. That Haiti is implicated. There's a debt to Haiti in the actual geographic makeup of the United States. And so we can go place to place to place to place. And there's like other examples. I won't walk you through all of them. But it's hardwired into the society. And our consistent unwillingness to confront this, our consistent unwillingness to examine this, has created disastrous implications. And been the cause, the reason why we need scholarship that willingly confronts the centrality and intractability of the issue of race in American society. So what do I mean by that? The bloodiest conflict in the United States, the Civil War, 4 years, some 720,000, some have estimates that are higher, Americans died, fratricidal warfare. It's still very possible to go places, and here it's said that the Civil War was not about slavery, was not fought about slavery. As a matter of fact, some months ago, I was in South Carolina. I had a conversation with a gentleman who was the head of the South Carolina Secessionist Party. He is a neo-Confederate, and really his mission is to lavish praise and honor upon those Confederates who fought and died, as he said, for matter of principle, and that principle was states' rights. He says to me, in this conversation, the vast majority of South Carolinians who supported the war did not do so for racist reasons. Racism had nothing to do with their motivation. They were concerned about the sovereignty and integrity of South Carolina, the encroachment of the federal government. I said, okay. But in response, I will tell you, the vast majority of South Carolinians were black and didn't support the Confederacy at all. South Carolina, Mississippi, two states that had a particular demographic quirk in which their black populations were larger than their white populations. So in the midst of this conversation, it just stopped. And it's almost like there was a ticker tape going across his forehead where it was like, wait, the slaves were also South Carolinians. Oh, mind blown. And so, where does this get us? How does this play out? What are the implications of this? Well, in 2015, a young man by the name of Dylan Roof walked into the sanctuary of Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, shot 9 people. Dylan Roof is a young white man. He killed 9 African Americans in a historic black church. He said that he was doing so as a call to arms for white people, that they needed to understand that their position at the top of American society was being jeopardized, was being risked, was being taken away from them. That they had to gather together and defend themselves as white people. I covered that trial, and in the midst of the trial, I walked from my hotel to the courtroom back and forth each day. And one day, as I'm walking past a building I've passed a dozen times, I look up and realize that it is actually the Confederate Museum of Charleston. And so I walk in, and I'm greeted by 2 women who could not be more polite and more welcoming. One is a woman who's maybe in her 40s, and the other is a woman who's maybe in, I estimate, in her 60s. And the younger woman says, welcome, gives me a brochure and tells me about all the materials that they have, and says that, this is one of the, best collections of Confederate memorabilia and so on that you'll find, and then she notices that I'm still wearing a court name tag. And she says, oh, what's bringing you to town? I said, well, I'm here to cover the trial of Dylan Roof. And she said, oh, we shouldn't have a trial. And I said, what do you mean? She said, just get rid of him. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, just get rid of him. And I said, well, it's interesting you say that because they're deliberating about whether or not to give him the death penalty right now. She said, there's no need to deliberate, just get rid of him. So I asked what was, to me, the obvious question. What do you make of the idea that Dylan Roof did what he did in that church in tribute to the cause that is being memorialized by this museum? Right, she looked that same way, like the way you're looking at me. And she was confused. She said, no, the Confederacy was not about racism. Confederacy was not about, that kind of treatment of people. And so I pushed further and said, well, why then is it that the Confederate flag is flown so frequently in conjunction with white supremacist groups? And she said, oh, they don't understand, they don't know, what happened, like they don't understand, they just, something they saw on the internet, they don't really understand what it is. And so the older woman said to me, well, I think it's really good that the community came together after those people were killed, because the last thing we needed was for Black Lives Matter to come and destroy the city of Charleston. And me, being somebody who has a very particular sense of humor, could not help but notice that she said this as she was standing next to a Confederate cannon. And I was like, Charleston was destroyed once before, but it wasn't by Black Lives Matter. And so what we have is a point at which I had to grapple with the complex implications of what had been done, and that the author of a horrific massacre, terrible, unconscionable, but he was actually being more honest about the history of the American South and the history of race in the United States than some of the best citizens. And when we saw what came after that, the removal of the Confederate flag from the front of the State House in South Carolina, and then Governor Nikki Haley made a very impassioned speech and talked about how it had no place in American society anymore, and that it would remain in museums and so forth. And it comes down. But what's left behind is something I almost didn't notice. There's a whole array of monuments that are on the grounds of the State House in South Carolina. And one of which is a memorial to Strom Thurmond, the famous segregationist senator, ran for president on the Dixiecrat platform in 1948, which had 3 planks, which was segregation, segregation, and more segregation. The tribute to Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the Reconstruction era governor of South Carolina, who had bragged about having led lynch mobs, and that memorial remained. The memorials to the Confederate soldiers who fought in the cause of the defense of the institution of slavery, that remains. But nothing was as disturbing as a monument that could seem innocuous at first glance. And that is the statue of George Washington that exists on the front steps of the South Carolina legislature. And it's not unusual, it's not atypical to have a statue of George Washington, in a public place. I noticed when I came in today that there's a statue of George Washington in the airport, right next to a figure of equal import, which is Franco Harris. Looked to my left, looked to my right, it's like, my mother was a huge football fan, she would have said Franco was more important. But the statue of George Washington is not unusual until you recognize that the statue was there to make a statement, which was the belief that the Confederacy was the heir to 1776. That George Washington was not only the father of the United States, but he was more specifically the father of the Confederacy. And that while the Confederate flag had been taken down, that particular interpretation of who Washington was and what Washington meant remained. And if you read Erica Dunbar Armstrong's book on Ona Judge, who was the fugitive slave that fled from George Washington's plantation and who Washington exhausted all his resources to track down, literally for the remainder of his life, although never succeeding in capturing her. You understand how this idea, how this connection is made. And so what we have is this contested sense of what this country is, of who constitutes it, of who is being referenced in the term "we the people." This ambiguity around what the word "we" means, who "we" is talking about. The end of slavery, Reconstruction, is a tremendous upsurge in democracy. More than 600 African Americans elected to political office throughout the South, some of whom are former slaves. Have this momentous development. There are people who were observers at the time who say in 1870 that the United States will have resolved all of its problems around race by the end of the decade. And this is thought to be a kind of realistic prognosis. There are amendments to the Constitution in rapid succession: 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, abolishing slavery, creating equal citizenship, giving the right to vote to African American men. This kind of leapfrogging progress. And what we see in the wake of that is a backlash. The creation of the Ku Klux Klan, the development of militias and vigilante groups throughout the South, the rise of a sharecropping economy and convict leasing as a form of economic exploitation of people who have been previously enslaved, the creation of a regime of segregation, black codes which eliminate the freedoms that have been just barely granted, to this population. All of this codified by the Supreme Court in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So we see in stunning order progress, resentment, and backlash. This becomes a cycle, becomes a means by which we can recognize almost where we are, almost a clock that we can use to understand where we fall in American history. And I've talked about this in particularly black-white dynamics, but it's not exclusively black and white. And so if I were to talk to you and say that there is a resentment directed at a particular ethnic group, very many of whom are located on the West Coast of the United States, in California, and there are accusations that they are taking jobs and bringing drugs into the country, we would say that we were talking about Mexican Americans or Mexicans. Or we could be talking about the Chinese in 1882, who are being accused of the whole political organization, the White Working Men's Party, established in California, meant to protect the jobs that were meant for white men, and to curtail the liberties and freedoms of Chinese who were thought to be bringing opium into the country. Or if I were to talk to you about a particular religious group that is thought to be aligned with the enemies of America, and for whom many people advocate increased surveillance and deporting those who don't share our objectives and our values as Americans. People would think that I was referencing Muslims, or I would be talking about Jews after World War I. As a matter of fact, that sentiment found expression in the 1924 Johnson Immigration Act, Immigration Restriction Act. And what the act does in 1924 is set quotas to say how many people could come into the country. Your possibility of immigrating was determined by a formula that was connected to the number of people from your group who were already in the society, who were already in the United States. And so if you were Irish and you wanted to come, then you're like, okay, how many Irish are already here? Maybe the Irish have come, and so we'll give a percentage of that. If you were Italian, if you were a Jew, if you were coming from Eastern Europe, all these things are kind of calculated to say, like, this is the percentage of the people we will allow in. And this is the 1924 Act. So how would you determine this number? You determine this number by the census. 1920 will tell you how many people of this background are in the country. Or the 1910 census, in which there'd be fewer. Or the 1900 census, in which there'd be even fewer. Or the 1890 census. So the 1924 Immigration Act grandfathers all the way back to the 1890 census, meaning that if you weren't here in 1890, it would be hard for you to get here in 1930. And this has disastrous implications in a very short period of time. Because a decade later, as fascism is rising in Europe, and there are many people desperately fleeing, trying to get away from the storm that is on the horizon, that quota system prevents them from coming into the United States. And so this is where we ultimately find ourselves, and what the ultimate implications of this are. The dynamic of nativism, of racism, of race and restriction, and the question of who belongs, and who is admitted into the society. So I grew up in Queens. I grew up in Queens, New York. And Queens has a particular distinction, which is if you are a kind of old movie buff, you know that it is where the movie Coming to America is set. Anyone remember that movie? Okay, all right, Coming to America. Eddie Murphy's character is a prince. He wants to find a queen. So he's like, Queens? There must be a lot of Queens here. There was another television show that was based in Queens called All in the Family many years ago. There's a character named Archie Bunker, played by the actor Carol O'Connor. Archie Bunker was this kind of man who was out of sorts. He's a working class white man who doesn't understand the world that's happening around him. And one of the great satirical parts of the show is when a black family moves in next door. And that family is the Jeffersons. Don't make me feel like I'm the only person. First off, I have to tell you, I've been like, when I make these references, I'm particularly self-conscious these days because like my beard went gray like overnight. I was like good, I was like perfectly cool, and then like one day it was like black, and then like a month later, I looked like I should be carrying stone tablets with commandments on them. And so, this has been like my version of a midlife crisis, being like, wait, what? The Jeffersons? You don't know what the Jeffersons is? In any case, there's a black family that moves in next door of the Jeffersons, and this is what becomes a great comic foil in this show. And Archie Bunker is this figure who's racist, but doesn't actually know that he's racist. So he says these things that are racist that seem to him to just be common sense. He also says these things that are sexist and like all sorts of kind of biases that he thinks like, everybody knows this, you know? And so this is like the kind of comic through line of that show. But Queens to me was a different place for one particular reason, which is that it was and is the most ethnically diverse county in the United States. There are at minimum 400 languages spoken in Queens. Some people estimated it as many as 800. I played baseball in high school, and I was a right fielder. I'm African American. Our center fielder was Dominican. Our left fielder was Jamaican. Shortstop was Colombian. Third baseman was Sikh, India. First baseman, we had two first basemen, one of whom was Jewish, one of whom was African American. Two of our pitchers were Jewish, our catcher was Jamaican. And so I would always say that we looked like the United Nations taking the field. And you know, we sucked. You know, but that was kind of beyond the point. But it's also crucial to remember that prior to 1965, when the immigration laws in the United States changed, Queens was the second whitest borough of New York City. There were very few people of color there. And so within a 20-year period between that law and the time that I entered high school, the county had rapidly transitioned. When immigration laws in the United States liberalized, there began people coming from the Caribbean, people coming from East Asia, people coming from South Asia. There were people coming from what are now the former Soviet republics, people coming from South America. There were people coming from all over the world. So I had classmates who were Greek, I had classmates who were Lithuanian, I had classmates who were Indian, I had classmates who were Pakistani, classmates who were Puerto Rican, who were Dominican, who were El Salvadoran. We could kind of walk through this entirety of this. And for me, this was the kind of idea that this is what the country was supposed to be, this is what community was supposed to look like. It was perfectly normal that we all went to school together. But there had also been a kind of backlash that happened as a result of this. And that the character Archie Bunker in that comedy was meant to be an expression of the anxieties of a particular population that saw the diversification of the country as a threat, that saw so many people coming from so many places as a disruption of what their community had been meant to be. Queens at this point, at one point, was so white that Jackie Robinson, who played for the Dodgers in Brooklyn, when he purchased a home in Queens, he would drive from Queens to Brooklyn to get to play. And in recent, well not recent, but relatively recent years, that route that he drove was renamed in New York as the Jackie Robinson Parkway. And so he buys a house in Queens, but a torch was burned, a cross was burned near his property to indicate that he was not wanted there. And that LaGuardia Airport was segregated, essentially. That they had waiting areas for black people and waiting areas for white people. And so this is what this was. And it goes from being that to being this incredibly cosmopolitan, global place. 2 years ago, Queens was, as Travel magazine, put as a top destination in the United States simply for the food, that you could get any kind of food that you wanted. Because wherever you went, there was a person from that community who knew how to cook that food. There was a restaurant somewhere that could serve it. And so we have a kind of perfect microcosm of what we've seen happen in the United States. With the language around diversification, and the language around immigration, and the language around rights, and the language around freedom, and the language around race, have all been intertwined, always been intertwined. And we've seen that reemerge recently. It's not coincidental that we've seen these anxieties expressed in the form of a president who, like myself, is also a native of Queens, New York. And so we have these threads of geography, and these threads of history that find themselves interwoven and intertwined. And really, we're lost, kind of stuck at this point if we don't understand the social history and the sociology and the cultural questions that are connected to this. Our present becomes inscrutable. There's another dynamic that we should keep in mind, that whites are about 62% of the population right now in the United States. If we calculated all the political offices, there was a group called the Reflective Democracy Campaign that did this analysis. We looked at all of the political positions in the United States, literally everything from your community board to the school board to the mayor to the city council to the governors and legislatures of all the states, every single political office that you could run for in the United States. Whites hold about 91% of those positions. And so people of color, however you construe that, if you're talking about Asian Americans, if you were talking about Latinos, if you're talking about African Americans, that other 37, 38% of the population are squeezed into 9% of the elected offices. It's a dramatic tilt. But we've had this conversation, we've had this debate in terms of fear and in terms of anxieties and in terms of recriminations and in terms of biases. And really the only thing, as a person who has devoted himself to two disciplines, history and journalism, that are kind of undergirded by a single connecting thread, which is that there is a belief that by informing the public, it can make wise decisions about how to govern the society in which we live. That's why I do the work that I do. And that's why African American studies is key, is a key component to that. Because these are all questions that, like the Freudian analysis of what a nightmare is, says it's an unresolved conflict and the nightmare continues until you resolve the conflict and is at the root of it. That race exists in that kind of nightmare space in American history. And so we confront these questions again and again and again and again until we resolve the underlying conflict. And so I'll end with this. It's like a kind of story. It's one of my favorite stories. And it involves an airplane. I was on an airplane, and this was not long after 9/11, and when kind of flying was like still a very like anxiety-inducing experience. And I'm going from Atlanta to New York, and I'm sitting on this plane, and I look up, and I'm about 2/3 of the way back in an aisle seat, and I look up and there's a guy walking toward me. He's walking down the aisle. He's tall, he is olive complexioned, he has a long beard, he is wearing a kufi and a kind of tunic and baggy pants. So he reads as Muslim. And you can almost see the tension ratcheting up as he walks closer toward me. And as fate would have it, he sits down across the aisle from me, one row back. And so I look at him, then I look over at him again, and I said, "Excuse me, where are you from?" And he looks at me and says, "Where are you from?" Which is, an appropriate response. And I said, "I'm from Queens." He said, "Okay." And everybody's listening now, right? Everybody's paying attention. I said, "I'm asking because I think you're from Queens too. And if you are who I think you are, we were in the same breakdance crew in high school." And he looks at me, he says, "Jelani?" I said, "Shake." I haven't seen him since high school. We stand up, we hug, we're talking, like, all the white people relax. He's a breakdancer, he's not gonna kill us. And the interesting thing about that moment to me was that he was a blank slate. So as we walked down the aisle, it was easy to project all our ideas onto him. That he was foreign, that he was Muslim, which means he was hostile, which means that he was some sort of antagonistic other, which means that he does not share our interests. I looked at him and saw the best breakdancer I knew in high school, and a person whose home I had eaten in, and whose neighborhood, whose community I had spent my formative hours in as a young person. And it's really the fundamental question about democracy, which is our ability to see ourselves in our neighbors, even if our neighbors don't look like us. And I think that this intellectual inquiry, this pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of information around these crucial questions of race and history and economy and law and sociology that are related to this theme, this crucial theme, are our best chances at doing that. And so it's not simply to say, take African American studies classes. It's to say, go out and learn more about how best to protect the possibility of creating an actual authentic democracy in the United States. Thank you. So we are going to some questions, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm sure Dr. Cobb will be happy to answer your questions, and I'll run around with the microphone so that everybody can hear. So open the floor to some questions or comments.
I have so many questions I was going to ask, but instead I'm just going to tell you a quick story. I think you'll appreciate it. I'm a graduate of Yorker College. What I was thinking about on the way over here was in 1968, when I articulated at Yorker College, right before I came here, our president, Courtney Smith, was in the middle of a problem with the Afro-Americans, and they were trying to start an Afro-American program at Yorker. They took over the admissions building, and Courtney Smith died of a heart attack that year.
Wow.
And today, the president of Yorker College, who you may know, is Valerie Smith, who's one of the top leaders of Afro-American studies in the country. She came from Princeton, and now she's the president of Yorker College. And somehow that just struck me as how things have changed from 1968, which, as you mentioned, is when really things got started with Afro-American studies in today. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I knew Valerie Smith had that job, but I did not know it had that particular history.
What?
I said I knew she had that job, I did not know it had that particular history, though. Did I answer everyone's possible question?
So you talk a lot about the sort of institutional racism in America. If you compare it to like other countries, why? Good. Okay. Oh, sorry. So you talked a lot about some of the like institutional racism in America's history. So what I was curious about is why don't we, do we see the same sort of thing throughout the rest of the world, or why is it like a uniquely American problem?
So that's very interesting. That's a very interesting question. We were actually talking about that before. And so to answer your question, no, race is imported into the United States and the colonies. And so it's a idea that exists in different contexts as well. But this is something I should have said at the outset, which is that race doesn't exist. And so if you make up something, if you lie about something, that lie will tend to have inconsistencies over time. You know, the truth tends to stay pretty straightforward. And so race doesn't look the same in the Caribbean as it does here. It doesn't look the same in South America as it does here. It doesn't look the same in Europe as it does here. There are some broad commonalities, particularly in colonial powers, especially when they have colonized other people who don't look like them. But even then, there are, huge disparities in the way that this plays itself out. So one of the things that's interesting about Haiti is that there are a lot, as the Haitian Revolution is happening, there are a lot of slave owners who flee and come to Louisiana. But in the French context, you could be a person who has a white father and a black mother and be a free slaveholder. In Louisiana, you are a Negro. And so you wind up with a kind of complicated, class of people who are biracial. And in some instances in Louisiana, they looked at Louisiana specifically, they looked at it differently. But for the most part, people who are enslaved in the South who have kind of biracial heritage wind up being enslaved. And so there is no kind of one uniform way in which this system plays itself out. But when the Dutch and the British colonized South Africa, they wind up with a system of apartheid that bears some very striking similarities to what Jim Crow looks like in the United States. And so, to answer your question, the other thing is this, that while France has issues with race, and while the UK has issues around race and racism, neither of them have black populations that are nearly as significant demographically as the United States does. And so we're in the West, 15% and higher, 17, 18% of the population might be black at any given point in time. And then you have South Carolina and Mississippi where the majority of your populations are black. And so that becomes a much more, and then the second thing is that the United States has this footprint which is staggeringly large and has held itself out as a kind of exemplar of human freedom. And so this big contradiction with a very significant portion of its population is very hard to ignore, but it does play itself out like in different ways in different other places. I think she was about to say.
I'm sorry.
You're talking about the civil rights movement, and like a lot of that was like focused on black people trying to get the right to vote. So I talked to my grandma, she's about 65 years old, and she votes every time, every election she can get to. And then I talk to like people who are my age who don't want to vote, who think that they're not a part of it and that they don't count. And like, how do you think that's really affecting like the political climate right now? Because if the majority of black people who voted could have voted, like, do you think like we would be in a situation that we are now currently?
So there's always a thing, like with young people who don't vote. That's not just black. That's across the board. Young people tend not to vote. But it's always a thing that you don't care about politics, but I guarantee you politics cares about you. And so they are making decisions on your behalf, and they will make decisions that you don't agree with very often because you haven't participated or done anything to inhibit their ability to make those decisions. And so that's the short answer of how that plays itself out. With African Americans, it's more complicated because we have things like felony disfranchisement, people who have arrest records can't vote, which is absurd because if you can't be trusted to vote, if you think that a person who's committed a crime should not be trusted to vote, we almost certainly should not trust that person with a driver's license. Because like one vote out of 325 million people, like your ability to damage things is pretty diluted. But if you can get behind the wheel, if you're not trustworthy enough to be able to vote, you can get behind the wheel and do something really crazy. Or we shouldn't allow you to hold a job. Or we shouldn't allow, any of the things that we think about, not to mention the fact that we also, people who don't have the right to vote, still have to pay taxes. And so we go back to that issue of taxation without representation. And so that's one of the things that impacts African American voters. And there's also kind of voter ID laws and various mechanisms of voter suppression, which is one of the things that's happening in Georgia now with the Stacey Abrams race. And it's not that simple. And one of the things that still is hard for me to wrap my mind around that there are people who would do things to try to make it more difficult for other people to vote. I played sports as a young person, and one of the things I guess I took away from it was that you either win or you lose. And if you aren't good enough to win, you deserve to lose. But the idea of not being good enough to win, but being able to find some kind of backdoor mechanism to prevent the other team's points from really counting and therefore winning doesn't really register in my mind. But that's one of the dynamics there. There are lots of other people in the United States that don't vote for reasons that we, the political scientists have looked into. Like for one, the absurd idea of holding our elections on Tuesdays. On elections in a work day where people who are hourly wage workers can't go. And so there's early voting in many places. In other places there's not. And when you try to, if you're trying to prevent a particular population from voting, you know that by kind of tinkering with early voting laws, you can do this. There's a whole ton of ways that things that factor into, off-cycle voting. If you have to vote for the president, if you have to vote for the city council at the same time that you vote for the president, you are going to come out and vote. But if it's the same year, but if the presidential election happens in 2020 and the city council election happens in 2021, that's one of those elections you go, oh wait, there was an election. I didn't even realize that. So there's a lot that happens that prohibits it. One of the last things I'll say is that the Supreme Court just liberalized the ability of districts to strike people from their voting rolls. And so you can register to vote, but it will now be easier for them to deregister you if you don't vote in one election. You can say, okay, well this is a dead registration, and then take it off. And this has particular implications for working class and poor people because they move a lot. Middle class and upper income people are stationary, but people who are lower income tend to move around a lot. So you actually need sometimes for your registration to catch up with you. But if you move and you're kind of stricken from the rolls, you may not even know until you show up to vote. And so all those things are complexities around why the voting numbers wind up looking the way that they do.
Hi, good evening. How are you?
Who? Oh, okay.
How are you? I read your article on Kanye West, Donald Trump, and the Truth About Chicago, and I must say it was very interesting and thought-provoking. I don't know if you saw the CNN coverage of that whole meeting. And
I saw some of it, yeah.
To quote CNN, they called Kanye West a dumb Negro and what happened when Negroes don't read. That's from CNN's.
He said what? They said what?
They called Kanye West a token Negro, a dumb Negro, and what happens when a Negro doesn't read. Those are their
CNN
words.
said that?
Yes.
I'm gonna need you to send me that quote.
Okay, we'll do. I don't know, but my question is, do you think that the media and their constant use of race, whether it be talking about blacks or whites or men and women, if that has any play in our current political talk about race and our understanding about it?
I think there's a lot of criticism that can be made about how the media handles issues of race, but constantly talking about it is not one of them. Because, in America we have this idea that, we can, somehow or another racism will disappear if we don't talk about it, which is kind of like saying, 10 years ago, we were like, oh wait, there's a recession, but just keep it to yourself. We need to just stop talking about this recession all the time. There are actual things that are happening as a result of race in society. And so we have to confront it, or else it winds up being intractable. If you don't talk about it, then it just happens and we don't have language. But it's the tree falling in the forest, and it still fell. It's did it make a sound or not? I don't know, but I know that it still fell. And if there were other trees around that they were damaged. And so, like, whether we talk about race or not, it still is an active agent in American society, an element in American society. And so we kind of have a responsibility to be as forthright as we can in dealing with it and addressing it.
So you talked about the underrepresentation of African Americans in political positions. Kind of take that same perspective. Why do you think at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans were so overrepresented and being drafted and sent to Vietnam to in combat positions, often to die?
Oh, yeah. It's interesting you say that. It was just having this conversation that African Americans, about 13 to 14% of the population, and they're something like 40% of the Vietnam casualties were black. Way far disproportionate. Part of that is about the fact that, well, if you talk to military people or kind of in defense of the military, they will say that African Americans wound up disproportionately in infantry because they didn't have like high educational attainment. But even if that were true, which I'm skeptical of, even if that were true, there's been a thumb on the scale in terms of how much educational attainment people got. And at every talk that I give, I wind up mentioning this, that I have a PhD. My father had a third grade education. It wasn't that my father wasn't smart enough. Is that in the town where he grew up in Jim Crow, Georgia, that was it. That was as far as black people went in school. And so the kind of politics of education have everything to do with that. So that's kind of one element of it. You then have things like the employment market, the labor market. So you, to this day, you have disproportionate, here's an interesting thing, that when you do public opinion polls, whites consistently think that blacks are less patriotic than whites are. But blacks are also consistently disproportionately members of the armed forces, and so are Latinos. And this has partly to do with what the employment market is. The other is that historically, because of things like the GI Bill and also Truman's desegregation order in 1948, the armed forces has had, rightly or wrongly, like this reputation as a meritocracy. Certainly a means by which somebody who can't afford education in some other way can afford to pay for education. And so all those things factor into you having a military that's disproportionately black and brown, and also disproportionately working class. So like the whites that you have who are in the military very often come from working class backgrounds as opposed to earlier points in American history, where you'd be much more likely to find middle and upper middle class people who have military track records too. You think about like John F. Kennedy, George Bush the first, people who came from elite families but were nonetheless had military backgrounds, and now you would not see that.
I first wanted to thank you for mentioning Election Day being on Tuesday, November 6th, right? Especially in a room full of students and professors who have class on Tuesday, specifically Tuesday morning. But my question is, with the Harvard case of Asian American discrimination and just unfair acceptance ratings, as we move forward in time, we come across this more gray area where you have the plaintiff in this case arguing that Harvard had these unfair acceptance quotas that disenfranchise Asian Americans. Whereas if they were to skew them and ignore race, that would disenfranchise Latino and African American students. How then do we face this more gray area, more than just black and white, but now a bunch of other races and people from different backgrounds and nationalities?
So that's a good question. It's always been more complicated though. And I won't walk you through the whole history of it because we don't have a whole lot of time. But these sorts of questions come up, again and again and again. Even like the kind of binary system that we have of race doesn't really answer or is not capable of answering like lots of questions that come up. Like in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge issue in Louisiana about how to Jim Crow the Japanese. They weren't white and they weren't black. So who do you send them to school with? And so it's very difficult to kind of sort this. And again, this is partly because this is all arbitrary, but what we're looking at with Asian Americans versus with blacks and Latinos is very often a kind of different relationship to this admissions process. So because of another challenge that came about in the 1970s in the Bakke case, the idea of affirmative action being used as a kind of recompense and say that because of something like my father being physically prevented from getting more education, that there needed to be policies that would be more advantageous for someone like me, and saying that the compound economic and social consequences of having a third grade education mitigate against you being able to get into an institution like this. And so that was what the original kind of ideas around this were. But as a result of this, one of the things that happened in this case, which was basically arguing that the whites were being discriminated against in so doing by quota programs, was that you could not have affirmative action as a kind of recompense policy, but you could have it for diversity. And so if you make that argument under diversity, and say that there's an intrinsic and inherent value in kind of diversifying an environment, which is true, but what also happens is that you are changing the demographics of a university while simultaneously ignoring the reason why the university had those demographics in the first place. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, Harvard had the same sort of challenge when it was had quotas, caps on the number of Jews that they would allow. Except then the president of Harvard wrote that it was in the interest of Jews to not have too much of a representation at Harvard, because that would engender resentment. And people would say, oh, we can't get in. And so this is largely a Jewish university, and so they won't even, the kind of stigma against Jews would be intensified by this. This is what the argument was at Harvard in 1910, 1920. And so for Asian Americans now, as we know, essentially their test scores have to be higher. And they're not simply competing against like blacks and Latinos who have a kind of historic exclusion from these institutions, but they are also competing against whites. And the question is, the way that we think about these questions is really very strange. Because, like for instance, the language of the achievement gap. So we say there's an achievement gap because black kids tend to score lower on standardized exams than white kids do. But white kids tend to score lower on standardized exams than Asian kids do. But we don't say that white kids have an achievement gap. And so it's a kind of normative reference points that becomes whiteness. And so that's where that real issue is. Like, you're not kind of making a recognition of the kind of legacy of history. You are making a diversity argument. And on the grounds of a diversity argument, they probably could get away with the policy that they have currently in terms of admissions. Now, one of the other things that's really interesting about this, that other kind of unspoken thing, is that Asian Americans are disproportionately represented in the elite institutions, disproportionately represented in graduate schools, disproportionately represented in very many of the professions, but underrepresented in the leadership of those professions. So when you start looking at things like CEOs, partners in law practices, partners in medical practices, all those other things like Asian Americans drop through the floor. And so if we're having this conversation saying that this is a meritocracy, and this is simply about how well you perform, how do you explain? You know, and even for all these other things that we're saying, you know, Asian Americans even wind up being underrepresented in political office. What's that about? And so there is a there in terms of the discriminatory impact. But how you make that argument for a policy that is set to just have a kind of diverse representation of different people, I don't know.
We have time for one more question. Since you're going to get the last question.
Can we get can we squeeze these two in?
Yeah, sure.
Anybody over here? Okay.
So the other day I saw Eric Holder, and I probably screwed my terminology, but just think about when the opposition party goes low, we go high, we kick them. I just wondered if you have a point of view on strategy. Whether one works the better in the end.
My version of that was like when they go low, we get punched in the private parts. But I mean, I think that your principles have to be your principles, and that if you only adhere to them when you're winning, then they're not your principles. And so one of the things I think has been like, in some of the more outrageous things that have happened in American politics, the desire has been to make people function and drag you down to the level, and I don't think that's something we should do.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you a question. I kind of write it down I said, do you think the idea of removing the teaching of slavery, genocide, such as the Holocaust, and the treatments of enslaved people in Native American public schools pushes this ideology or concept of reverse racism as being possible or probable, or that different privileges are not real or constructed into our society as a whole?
I'm not really hearing that. Like you said, is it constructive to teach?
Oh, sorry. I said, do you think that removing the teaching of slavery and genocide, such as the Holocaust and the treatments of enslaved people and Native Americans in public schools, pushes this ideology of reverse racism as being possible, different privileges as not being real?
I think you're asking me if it's like, if it leads, huh?
I've had like people tell me how like they believe reverse racism is like actually like possible, and I don't really believe that. And they talk about how like white privilege or any privileges are just not real. That's no such thing.
Yeah. That's like a funny thing though, that in opinion polls, there are lots of white people who will tell you that whites are the most disadvantaged group in American society. Which we can laugh, but it is a very real sentiment. Now, it is a sentiment that is not upheld by any indicator. That when you look at projected lifespan, whites, longer lifespan, projected life income, whites are at the top. If you look at, just I just mentioned, the political representation, whites are overrepresented politically. If we look at Congress, if we look at the business world, we look at all these kinds of things. We look at housing. If you have African Americans and whites of equal income, their home values will still be radically different, simply because the family is white. That if a white person family lives in a white neighborhood, there will be a value associated with the fact that it is a white neighborhood. And so that's just not empirically true. Empirically, it's untrue. That there is no kind of systemic bigotry that is being directed at white people in this country. But as I usually tell my students, that if you're engaged in an argument and one person is using facts, another person who's using feelings, the person who's using facts is at a disadvantage. And so the feeling that whites are at a disadvantage is a kind of much more visceral concern, and it's difficult to kind of make that argument. But you could, by the way, like, it's not new. It's not new. in American history, if you looked at, there's a new documentary actually called King in the Wilderness, which is very well done. And there's a point where Martin Luther King is kind of, in 1967, 68, he's like really frustrated that maybe the movement has stalled out. He's not sure if he's at the end of his road, politically. And there's a march that they're leading, there's a white person who's holding a sign that says, "What about white rights? What about white people's rights?" There's nobody who's going to shoot you if you try to vote. There just is not. There's no one who's going to stop you from buying a house in any particular neighborhood. There's no one who's going to deny you a job on the basis of your skin color. There is no neighborhood that you have to worry about people burning you out of if you do move to that community. There is no, it's a kind of an absurd kind of list. It's like an absurd kind of thought question. Or if you even went back to kind of capping this with the Confederacy, it is really breathtaking in the United States that 11 states went to war, fought for the right to own human beings, lost, and have perennially viewed themselves as the victim as a result. So wait, they stopped you from selling people, and you were the one that was wrong? That is like a very kind of cloistered point of view, but it is a prevalent one. And it is a durable one, and it's a powerful one if you look at how people kind of were emotionally invested in what was happening in the 2016 election. So to answer your question, the way that we teach history, what we do and what we don't teach in history is directly related to that. And the final point I'll say about that is this. I'm making the worst sales pitch ever, which is like, on the one hand, you have the option of thinking of yourself and your country as blameless, as ideal, as fundamentally better than other places in the world, as exempt from the worst of human characteristics. And these things would seem to be validated by the fact that so many people want to come to this country, that this is the largest economy, that it has the largest military, that if you're going to make an argument that the United States has been blessed and singled out by God, these are the things you have in your favor. And I'm actually making the argument of saying, no. Don't be seduced by those blandishments. Don't dwell on being the oldest constitutional democracy. Don't solely dwell on being the richest society in the world. Actually think about the tragic, inhumane, unconscionable actions that have stained this country's history. Think about the shortcomings, think about the failures, think about the cruelties, think about the oversights, think about everything that has gone wrong. Who wants to do that? But what I'm saying is that the only way that we actually do get to become a valid and true exceptional society is to not fall for the premature presumption that we already are. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming.